So thanks for coming, everybody. We are talking about alt text. This is an overview of what we're going to be covering, and there's actually a lot to be said about something that should be as simple as alt text, but things when it comes to web accessibility are rarely that simple. So we're just going to cover some of the basic stuff. What is alt text? Why does alt text matter? What are some of the rules of alt text? And this includes best practices, specific use cases, and we're going to find out that alt text, the alt text that we write for images is not necessarily going to be the same as alt text for simple charts and more complex charts. We're also going to cover things to avoid when you were writing your alt text. And some of them are a bit more common sense mistakes, like spelling or grammar, but we'll get into that. And then we're going to touch a couple different subjects about alt text, namely one about how alt text can benefit SEO, and lastly, talking about how representation works in alt text. And then lastly, we'll make some time for a Q&A too. So what is alt text? Pretty simple explanation here. Alt text is the text-based substitute for media elements on a web page, such as charts, graphs, or images. And since we work primarily in Drupal, we have this built in a way that you more or less have to include alt text. Otherwise, it just simply won't save to your page. But the real challenge here really isn't so much lack of alt text. It's really a matter of getting alt text right. And that's why today we're going to focus mostly on images, simple charts and graphs, and more complex charts and graphs, which we'll kind of see how alt text looks pretty different for each of those shortly. So, pretty simple question. Why does alt text matter? Why is it important? The biggest reason is accessibility purposes. Alt text is vital for people who are relying on screen readers to navigate and access a website. So primarily when we're thinking about alt text, we're thinking about people with visual impairments in mind, but this can also include other groups as well. Anyone using a screen reader device or any other assistive device or software relies on alt text to narrate an image's contextual information to the user. So I'm going to hammer on these words here: contextual information, context and information, more so than just simple description. And there's going to be a very big reason why I do that. So we're going to be walking through what poor alt text looks like as well. So to hammer the point home, this image to the right here, this is from the minor in French on the FRIT department website, Department of French and Italian. So I want to ask a question, and you can either shout your answers out or you can type them in the chat here. If this image had no alt text, what context or other information would a blind user miss out on? Student experience, study abroad. That is precisely it. That is exactly what I've written down anyway. So the French minor has a study abroad component that students can they can access essentially. So if you're in the French minor program, there are opportunities for study abroad. And this image here is a student on a study abroad program. So if none of the text below communicates this and that information here, this just gives you a basic overview of what the program is, mostly reasons to minor in French, but it does not explain that it has this component to the program at all. So a user who's blind, and assuming this is all the information there is on this page, thankfully the actual page does have more information than just this one paragraph here. But if it didn't, hypothetically, then users with disabilities would miss out on that key context. So is that bad alt text or bad copy? This is really just a I would just say this is more probably in the latter category, bad copy. This image does have alt text. I don't have the alt text showing on here. But this is basically just trying to kind of sell you on why you should minor in French. It's not really telling you anything else about this. So, like I said before, the actual minor French page, it has this information. But hypothetically, if this is all there was, and there was no alt text to this, that information would be inaccessible. So that's the accessibility reason behind alt text. I'm also going to go into the usability side of things as well. So this also bleeds into the accessibility portion, but this is something that tends to encompass more the general population as well. So the other function of alt text is to describe what certain media elements are supposed to be whenever they fail to load on a web page. So if we look down at the example below, there's an image of Saint Isidore of Seville. This is from the University of Dayton blogs, by the way. This is when the image loads correctly. Everything's working on the website as we expect. Whenever the digital image doesn't load correctly and it doesn't have alt text, we get this blank space here. We have like a broken little image. Any context or information that this image contains is totally lost for everybody. But whenever the image doesn't load properly, but it does have alt text, we still know what's supposed to be there. St. Isidore of Seville. This benefits not just people with disabilities, this is helping everyone else as well. This is an example of the curb cut effect, where something that is made with users with disabilities in mind is benefiting everyone else. And a very common example of that is usually like subtitles or captions on TV or movies or videos and things like that. But this is essentially just a very brief overview of how alt text benefits everybody else and can make your site more usable to the general population, not just people with disabilities. We covered what alt text is, we covered why it matters in terms of accessibility and usability. This is more the nitty-gritty. This is just some of the best practices. So this page, we kind of focus on two big things. There are more best practices, so it's not just remember these two things here. But these are two major things to kind of keep in mind. They're very general. You typically apply this no matter what media item that you're writing alt text for. So first rule, try to keep it concise. It's around 20 words in most cases. In the case of charts, especially more complex ones, then you tend to get a little bit more wordy. But for the most part, the good rule of thumb is around 20 words or so. That being said, and this is what I hammered on earlier about context, you're describing the most relevant parts of the image. So when you're trying to think about, like, let's take an example, the image to the right here. What's the most valuable thing happening in the image? What is the image communicating? What are the parts that you need to describe to the reader to get your point across? So in these two cases here, we have a student reviewing analytics data, and the one below that is an event, a Buckeye-thon event in the Ohio Union lobby. So those are two things to kind of keep in mind, making sure that your alt text is kind of short and sweet, concise, but also descriptive enough to where it's communicating all the most relevant aspects and the context of what's happening. That said, we do have a feature built into Drupal that allows you to mark images as just decorative images. And what does this mean exactly? So in terms of accessibility, a decorative image is not read when someone with a screen reader is having a web page narrated to them. So they generally, a decorative image, usually it's just there for aesthetic purposes. It's not really communicating anything in terms of important information or context. It's just there to kind of look pretty. If it doesn't load or isn't available for whatever reason, no one's really losing out on anything. And this also helps you keep things from becoming redundant. Knowing which images to mark as decorative is pretty important for accessibility too, because if someone with a screen reader is using this, And this image in particular, which really doesn't, it's pretty abstract. It's not really communicating much of anything. It's not going to be helpful or beneficial to someone with a screen reader to try to explain what this is. It's just there for decor. It allows users to skip over this image that really doesn't really help understand anything. So this section, this one in particular, it's just kind of reviewing some of the points I made earlier. This is just covering alt text for images. But after this, we're going to talk a little bit more about simple and complex graphs. So some rules for images. I've already kind of mentioned them before. Being concise, aiming for around 20 words or so to describe an image, and describing the context behind what's happening in the image. So if you look to the right here, this is something that you might want to ask yourself. What is happening in the image? What's the context? What is the situation? What's the scenario? Things like that. Marking an image as decorative if it's just there for aesthetic purposes, not there really for any context or informational reason. If the image is a link, so this is mostly relevant on Drupal since we use a lot of features like callout boxes and advanced callout boxes. In the case of regular basic callout boxes, where it essentially makes an image serve as a link or a button, then the alt text should describe where users will go if they click that link. And lastly, if the image has any text on it, the alt text should match what the image says. So if you have an image that has quite a bit of text or has information about an event, like times, location, phone number, things like that, then the image, or the alt text should communicate that as well. We are still technically within the realm of images because in Drupal, anything like a chart or graph is still treated like an image. If you have something like, for example, the chart to the right, and you have, for whatever reason, you're uploading this to a web page, or any other simple chart like this. Oh, I see a question from Gabe. Let me see. Even when that info is redundant with the copy on the page. That's actually a very good question. In some cases, it might make sense. If there's already a descriptive text there, then if you could probably get away with leaving out that information. Because that way, if there's still like text above or below it, even if it's just regular body text that's communicating that information, then what's important is that that context of information is still accessible, even if it's not in the alt text. So when we get to like the latter portion of this, we talk about avoiding redundancy in alt text, because that's also an accessibility reason as well. You don't want to bombard users with disabilities with redundant information that's already there. So if for whatever reason there isn't any of that text, like for the image to the right here, this is when we would probably rely more on the alt text itself to communicate this data. So this is a pretty simple one. It's just covering it's offering a breakdown of users who are visiting a website through Firefox, Chrome, or Safari. And an example of what that would look like is it's pretty short, simple, and concise. So what I have written down here, and I asked my team to confirm that this was an acceptable one, the accessibility team on web services. So I got, this is web accessibility approved here. So this is, the alt text says here, this is a pie chart showing 200 website sessions from Firefox users, 180 from Chrome users, and 130 from Safari users. So we're in a case of simple charts and graphs. It's just making sure that, it's just making sure that your alt text is matching what's already listed here. If for some reason the descriptive body text doesn't have that information, then making sure that the alt text is concisely conveying that information is basically the good rule of thumb here when it comes to simple pie charts or other simple graphs like that. Now, this is where we get into the more complex charts and graphs. This is when things get a little bit more trickier. And we start to rely on a little less on the alt text side of things and more on the descriptive side of things, because you do not want your alt text to be long and burdensome. Otherwise, a person with a screen reader, that device is going to be relaying all that information to them. So it's much more beneficial to have like a brief overview of what this is, this chart, and then having everything else maybe as descriptive text. So as an example, this is just an image. This is just a chart covering media sources about the Iraq War. And the descriptive text here below what this title is basically, it's right in the lead. It's providing the context here. Analysis of media coverage during the Iraq War was by no means universally objective. So we already have like some context, but we get the details later, giving a breakdown of who is covering, what news sources are covering, like the Iraq War, but also giving you an example of if that's being communicated in a pro-war narrative, or if it's also being covered in a more neutral category. So we have the context at the top. We have a description of what the details are here. The third sentence in this paragraph of descriptive text is kind of giving a little bit more detail. And last, it gives you a little count. It's measuring some of the metrics in the chart here. So if you're writing alt text for this image, but you have already this descriptive text right up here, it would still be a good idea to try to provide a very simple breakdown of the information here, such as the layout, the metrics, some of the trends, what are the categories being measured here, what's the context. But for the most part, if you are trying to communicate context or trying to give a more thorough breakdown, instead of alt text, you're going to want to rely on more descriptive text throughout the page, like simple body text or something like that. And I know this is a little bit more of a complicated one, so I wanted to see if anyone has any questions on this front. I'm looking at the meeting chat here just to see if anyone posts anything. This one's from Christina. The descriptive text also helps readers who maybe aren't as used to reading charts as many of us are. Yeah, so ability or disability aside, the way we process information is pretty different. Some of us prefer more visual representations. Some of us prefer more literary ones, more reading rather than just trying to interpret information visually here like that. What would alt text be for this chart? That's a very good question. So if I were to write alt text for this specific one, the most important information that I would try to convey here would be, if I would have to come with this up the top of my head, I would be more interested in trying to get this general breakdown across. So because this is essentially measuring coverage, how the Iraq War is being covered and who is covering it. So if it's an American source, it's more likely to be in favor, according to the chart here. And if it's a non-American source or some other third party, it's more likely to be neutral. So I would try to provide maybe like a short description of what these numbers are in relation to the coverage here, which is it's easier to demonstrate rather than describe. But if for whatever question, if you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out, because we do have a team of people who do work specifically with accessibility, and they can give you a very good walkthrough on how best to communicate this kind of information. So that's just one of the services that we offer at the web services team. We do have accessibility experts to help you out with this stuff. So if everyone feels, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else here in the chat. If the descriptive text provides all the info, could we select decorative for the chart, or would we still need alt text? That's true. I would try to play it safe and try to convey as, yeah, I would still try to provide alt text and try to make it as basic as possible description, just so your users with disabilities or screen readers know that there's something here, even if this is still being conveyed here. Oh, we got one from Gabe. Bar chart shows that American sources are. Yeah. So I'm just going to read what Gabe wrote here. So as an alt text example, bar chart shows that American sources are 71% pro-war, 3% anti-war, and 26 neutral, while total sources are so on and so forth. Yeah, that's a really good starting point. Eduardo, would it be best to go to the person who created the chart since we aren't all experts in the field? If there's a way for you to contact people on that, because this one, we already know the source. This is an example taken from Harvard Accessibility. So assuming that they're the ones who actually produced this, or if the whoever who actually performed the research for this chart, which is listed in the chart itself, this is something that you might want to include in the descriptive text as well. So this is something that the source of the research being presented would be better suited, I think, for descriptive text rather than alt text. But if there is a way that you could reach out to them, and if you wanted to provide like a more simple breakdown, that's fine. Because at the end of the day, you're essentially trying to make this more accessible. We see. I've definitely done that when writing about science. Usually this is from Christina, by the way. I've definitely done that when writing about science. It's usually better to send them your draft instead of having them write it, since that will be more on the level of most. This is excellent advice, especially because throughout our jobs, we usually might get charts or reports or data that we personally are simply not equipped to either understand as well as an expert in the field or explain as well as an expert in the field. So reaching out, if you can, just to kind of get a good idea of how you should break this information down to make the findings of this data more accessible, that is totally something we would encourage you to do. So does anyone have any more questions before I move on? Because I know this is one of the more complicated parts of the alt text that we're talking about here. If everyone feels like they're good, we can move on to the next section. But I want to make sure everyone feels like they're comfortable with dealing with complex charts and graphs. I'm not seeing anything else. So if everyone feels like this has been well covered, or if you have any questions, feel free to reach out about this. And then that way we can get you a better answer, because we want this to be as easy to understand and grasp as possible. And when it comes to more complicated stuff, this can be pretty tricky, especially if you are more concerned with being in compliance with university guidelines when it comes to accessibility stuff. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. We're happy to help you. So we're going to be moving on to the next section here. Things to avoid when writing alt text. So the most common mistake here, it's the very first one. I'm guilty of this too, but it's something that we should really avoid doing, is avoiding the use of terms like image of, picture of, or photo of when it comes to alt text, because that's frankly very redundant. Someone with a screen reader is going to know that there is an image here if there's proper alt text. They don't really need the alt text to say image of, picture of, et cetera, et cetera. This can also include screenshots, you might want to avoid that as well. But yeah, moving on to the next thing to avoid, and this kind of ties into the very first one, just redundant descriptions. If your descriptive text throughout the body of your web page has this information already there, then you don't want to repeat that information in the alt text itself. It's just not necessary. It's redundant. Your body text will be enough in that case. So when you're writing alt text, you just want to make sure you're adding context, not just repeating what's already been said to the user. If the image already has a caption, this is kind of me repeating myself. It's kind of me being a little redundant, ironically. If the image has a caption, you don't need to repeat exactly what the caption text says in the alt text. This kind of goes back to adding context and information rather than just repeating what's already been said. If possible, you might want to avoid using jargon or overly technical language instead of just plain language. This is just more like a general rule for everyone. It just makes your alt text more usable. Jargon and overly technical language it really resonates with a smaller audience who may or may not have a level of familiarity as the general population or a layman, depending on what your image is about. So you just want to avoid being overly jargony or overly technical and just trying to kind of communicate what's there and as plain as speak as possible, not just for people with disabilities, but just for everyone in general, especially when an image fails to load. This one's pretty obvious, spelling and grammar mistakes. Just kind of make sure you're avoiding these. Just do a little proofreading. Because again, if someone is using a screen reader, it's going to narrate the spelling and grammar mistakes you have there. So just kind of keep this in mind. Vagueness and ambiguity. This is another one that I would encourage you to be a little bit more mindful about, especially because, looks like we have a question here. On people's department's profile pages, should the images be marked as decorative since their name is already on the page? That depends. So ultimately, this is actually a pretty good question here. So if you are avoiding wanting to be redundant, if you're talking about like a profile page, there are several different ways you could represent someone in the alt text. And that's actually what we're going to cover last and the real answer behind that is it providing context? So if you have a faculty member, and let's say they're a scientist, right? So if they're in the lab doing some kind of work, you might want to say Professor so-and-so working on XY machine. Whereas if it's them just kind of posing, it's just like a portrait or a photograph, then you could get away with saying just the name of the person. But if you actually want to provide some descriptive details, like skin tone, eye color, body shape, anything like that, then that's something you can do as well. Hopefully, I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to reach back out and ask for details. So I was on vagueness and ambiguity. So this is just essentially making sure that you're not being overly vague. I think one example I remember seeing about this, and I don't remember which site, where there was a picture of a jar, and all that was listed in the alt text was the country the jar was from, which doesn't really tell you anything. It's pretty lazy. So if for whatever reason you're posting a very specific jar from a country, you might want to provide some context, like where it's at, what's this used for, things like that. Just making sure that it's pretty clear what your alt text is describing. And lastly, not enough alt text. And this can also tie into this last point here with the example I gave, just making sure that your alt text is descriptive enough. So when writing alt text, there's a bit of a balance between conciseness and descriptiveness, where descriptiveness is trying to get in as many details as possible, whereas conciseness is more about kind of keeping it short and direct as possible. So in this case, not enough alt text is usually just either a result of people trying to be too concise. experience, I don't think there's an issue with people just being lazy when it comes to alt text. Oh, this one's from Jessica. Okay. Since we should avoid saying image of, should we avoid saying that things are charts and just stick to what info is on the chart? I would actually, this might seem counterintuitive, I would lean towards the latter. I would indicate that there is a chart here because usually a chart or graph is trying to convey some kind of data or like a data set, right? And I think it's usually better to err on the side of caution and say pie chart, or if we want to go back a little bit, because what I had for the simple, so for the example here, I just have alt text that says pie chart showing 200 website sessions from Firefox users and so on and so forth. So I'm indicating that this is a pie chart here. So I'm not just conveying what the data is saying. I'm also conveying that there's a data set present here that's being visually represented. And that might seem redundant, but in that case, and this is something that I've talked to our accessibility people about. In this case, this is an exception that we would say, yes, indicate that this is a chart, that this is a pie chart, or that it's a bar graph, or whatever kind of graph that you're using. Do we add link to for links on the name of the text? Do screen readers get that information? It's usually a better idea just to kind of describe what the website is. So let's say hypothetically, you have a link or an image that is a link, and you want that to indicate where the user is going. And let's just say in this example, it's the main OSU website. You can just say to the main Ohio State website in your alt text, because the screen readers typically will indicate if something is a link or not. So things to avoid, just kind of like rehashing what I said here, just making sure you're avoiding, for the most part, image of, picture of, photo of, except in the case of charts and graphs and stuff. Avoiding redundant descriptions, make sure you're not repeating any information. You're adding context and information, but you're not repeating it. Simple spelling and grammar mistakes, avoiding jargon and overly technical language, and making sure that your alt text isn't being vague or ambiguous. So those were more or less the best practices, things to do, things to avoid when it comes to alt text, right? So this is the last portion of the presentation. So this is just more about why alt text is important in this case. So in this case, if your concern is primarily improving your search engine optimization, which is basically more or less just making your site more visible in Google and other search engines. So the way that actually ties in, how having well-written alt text improves your SEO. So Google uses software called crawlers to find your website. And not only that, it's storing any information in the code about the website. And this includes anything like your links, images, and HTML tags. And alt text in HTML land is an HTML tag. So I don't have an example really to the right here, but the tag in question here that I've listed as an example is a cat sleeping on a chair. So if for whatever reason a user is using Google to find anything like an image about a cat sleeping on a chair, Google is going to use this alt text to help determine whether this is a relevant search item or not. So in that way, Google is essentially using several kinds of information, but alt text is one of them to make sure that they are presenting the most relevant search results for users here. And assuming that you are doing your alt text properly, it's well written, it's concise, it's something that would match what someone would use, then Google is going to make that site more visible. It's going to rank it higher up. So alt text plays a minor role, but still plays a role in your search engine optimization. And lastly, alt text and representation. And this can be one of those tricky ones because remember earlier, we were talking about how would you, if you have a faculty member or a member of staff and their profile page has a picture of them, how would you write alt text for them? So this gets into the topic of representation. And the short answer behind this question of whether you should include identifying traits of somebody doesn't really have a perfect answer. But there are some things that you can use as a rule of thumb to kind of determine with your best judgment, how would you describe someone with your alt text, right? So some of the things that you might base your alt text description on, this can be something like, physical ability, race, gender identity, presentation, religious affiliations, body types, ethnicities. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's all kinds of different descriptors that you could write into your alt text. One of the rules of thumb that I would recommend here is that it would be helpful to include these traits or any of these identifying traits if it helps provide context to understand the image. So for example, if you have just a picture of a bunch of students on the oval just going about their day, it probably would not make any sense to go about describing the facial features, body types, race of everyone in the image. Now, if there is some context to the image where this might make sense, so if you have, let's say, a website that is like a history website, and you're covering the civil rights era, then it would probably make more sense to include something like race into the alt text description, because that is going to help convey the context here. So that is just something to keep in mind. If you're not sure, feel free to reach out. But like I said before, there really isn't a perfect answer. So keeping in mind is just trying to figure out what helps readers understand the context. That's it. Also, there are inclusivity reasons for why you may want to include any of these traits as well. And these are totally perfectly valid reasons. So because this is one of the trickier areas when it comes to alt text representation anyway, does anyone have any questions on this front?
You know, I think that the profile pictures are a particularly sticky one, right? Because obviously we want our users to be able to look at our faculty pages and see the diversity of people who are here and all of that and the representation, but we also can't as web users prescribe that onto everyone. Like, you know, no one knows how I identify versus anyone else, right? But I'm not seeing that on OPIC, but also then the alternative of that is to not use OPIC. That seems counterintuitive, like to,
Yeah.
you know, um, so
Yeah,
yeah, that might be something to look at university level. So
that's something, yeah, I think that's definitely a conversation that should be had. Um, but moving away from the OPIC, I think you brought in a good example, is the prescription when it comes to determining what identifying traits you are including in alt text descriptions. And it kind of just goes back to the answer that there isn't really a perfect answer. So in this context, one of the takeaways that I hope you walk away with this last section here is that there really isn't so much a prescription to offer, but just rather a couple things to kind of keep in mind. Namely, that going back down below, would including any of these traits here, would that help readers understand the context or information being conveyed in the image? And again, if you're trying to be inclusive, then it might behoove you to include these. But again, though, it's not always clear how or what somebody identifies as. So especially when it kind of gets into, especially when it kind of gets into things like either religion, gender identity, ethnicity, things like that, it's not always clear what this could mean here, or how we would include that in the alt text. And if it might be better for the context of the image, or to the understanding the context behind the image to not include these, then I would also say that's fine too. This is like one of the trickier ones where there's some territory that's kind of murky, and there are potential issues whether you do or you don't include all like this kind of description in your alt text. And if you're not always sure, feel free to reach out to us. And I believe ASC Com might be able to help answer that as well, because that's also kind of going into messaging as well. But yeah, if there's no other questions on this front, we can make time for the Q&A. So managed to cut, we got about 10 minutes left in the presentation. So I know that was kind of a particularly long one. So if there are any other questions that you feel like have yet to be answered, or if there's something you're unsure about, feel free to use this time to ask away.
So I had a question. It's maybe a more technical question, but with how does alt text work with the image gallery as far as like making, because alt text needs to be so contextual, right? So if you're reusing an image, the Buckeye seal or the Buckeye-a-thon image from your slides earlier, right? You may want that description to be different in the different places that you use it. Like, does Drupal like allow for that, or when you set the alt text, that's just the alt text?
So the way Drupal handles that has changed, especially as they've updated the content, the media library, excuse me, because I know that the name changes for that too. So usually the website stores a default alt text description for what you have for an image. So in the case of that Ohio State seal, there is a saved alt text description that is just there by default, but you should be able to edit that on the page if you feel like it would be more helpful for the sake of context, to do so. So there's that option still should be there. And it does, to my knowledge, it does not override the saved alt text that's already there.
Can you maybe get back to us and confirm that? Just because,
yes.
yeah, like the Buckeye-a-thon image is a good example, right? If I'm using that on one page to sort of provide the context of how fun and exciting student life is here at Ohio State, it might be incredibly important to say something like, student dance event at Ohio Union, right?
Right.
But if it's the lead image for the news article about Buckeye-a-thon, where I'm going to then wax poetically about how great Buckeye-a-thon is for 3 paragraphs, I don't need to describe that in the image, right?
Yeah.
So
that said, does anyone else have any other questions or comments or anything like that? Looks like the chat is pretty quiet. So yeah, I'm happy to wrap things up here. I honestly did not expect to have a presentation about alt text of all things go this long, but it kind of goes to show that this is a accessibility topic that isn't as simple as one would think. But yeah, I really appreciate everyone coming here. So unless there's any other questions, last minute comments, or things like that, then yeah, happy to wrap up.